Can I get a show of hands? Who's familiar with AOT, or a sort of outpatient treatment? Okay, good. We have some exposure in the room. So we're going to read you a brief general definition. This is what you're going to encounter in the official literature, and then we are going to bring you into a deep dive of our understanding and perspective on AOT today. So typically, AOT is framed as a community-based, court-ordered mental health treatment program utilized specifically in the US for a subset of individuals with serious mental illness who have a history of involuntary hospitalizations, arrests, or demonstrated difficulty adhering to treatment and staying well while living in the community.
Beautiful, thank you, Lindsay. So my portion of this talk is I'm just going to offer a general overview of mental health care in the United States from about the mid-1800s onward to try and position AOT within a broader perspective and where it is today. One premise I'm working with, and I think which Sasha Warren demonstrated very well this morning, is that the history of mental health care is one of competing visions, one between a system marked by paternalism, institutions, and neglect, most exemplified by the asylum system and the subsequent neglect of mental illness we've seen in the deinstitutionalized era. And two, a system of autonomy, community integration, and positive support, which has yet to really be realized. While such a better system, in my view, was briefly attempted in the second half of the 21st century, ideological shifts in political economy have led to a heavily divested, disassembled community mental health system. It's returned the United States to a situation resembling the 1800s, where the problem of mental illness is understood as an issue of homelessness, incarceration, and social disorder. As a result, a system of institutions is again being seen as a viable solution to this problem, despite its sordid track record over the previous centuries. Meanwhile, a community integrated system, which was never really tried, has been erroneously deemed a failure and omitted from public imagination on what mental health care could look like. So, going back to the 1900s, I start the story with the advocate Dorothy Dix. Dix was a 19th century social crusader who was shocked by the inhumane treatment of the, quote, indigent insane in American jails and prisons. Believing these people were entitled to a better life than one of squalor and punishment, as I think everyone does, Dix dedicated her life to nationwide advocacy to develop a system of asylums for these mad people. In theory, these institutions would provide a calm, safe, structured alternative to life in prisons or on the streets, hence the peaceful term asylum. But what started with ideals of care and tranquility soon ran into harsher truths about institutional living, where asylums were generally rife with abuse, neglect, and the removal of basic rights and liberties for its residents. Their reputation suffered greatly from journalistic exposés and other reports showing these abuses to the public, who started seeing asylums in a fundamentally negative and inhumane light. Moreover, at its peak, the United States per capita asylum population in the middle of the 20th century was as large as the per capita prison population in the United States today, which we know is historically large. And just like prisons, asylums were very costly to maintain. This catalyzed a period of deinstitutionalization and a brief pursuit of an alternate vision for people with psychiatric disabilities to live in the community. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act, which sought to deinstitutionalize the asylums and transfer patient care to a nationwide network of community mental health centers. This would allow patients to live and work in the world just like anyone else. The act was unfortunately short-lived, and its practical implementation faced many barriers. Enduring stigma about mental illness placed the issue near the bottom of political priorities, making it an easy one to ignore, just as it still is today. And the war in Vietnam consumed federal spending to the direct expense of domestic spending. By the late 1970s, the Community Mental Health Act had built only around half of its targeted community support centers, and then the country experienced the neoliberal shift in government. Neoliberalism included an ideological turn against government intervention to address social problems, leaving them to be sorted out by the free market and private sectors. This was all part of a larger Cold War-era anti-communist attack on the welfare state, which overgeneralized all social services and benefits as, quote, socialism or, quote, communism, also still going on today. Neoliberalism also included a move towards policing and criminal justice to address social problems, which also proved very consequential for the afterlife of deinstitutionalization. The Community Mental Health Act was formally terminated in the early Reagan years, but deinstitutionalization persisted, this time in a drastically different context of political economy than when the act was signed. While most people released from asylums saw a better quality of life in the community than they had in institutions, a significant minority of ex-patients returned to families or communities where stigma remained powerful, ostracization endured, and supports for independent living were inadequate and under political attack. With the federal government having retreated from housing aid at the same time as it bolstered the prison system, many patients left asylums and became part of a homeless and incarcerated population, which persists to this day. Just as importantly to the fate of the community mental health system, the neoliberal era also implemented a philosophy of public budgeting referred to as, quote, starving the system, a term that a Reagan advisor came up with. The purpose of, quote, starving the system was to manipulate government spending in a way that would amplify its debts and deficits, which can then be used to justify cuts to welfare spending, which would then benefit this Cold War anti-communist attack on, quote, communism or socialism, but as most people experience it, is just an attack on social services and benefits. Starving the system follows a simple and readily observable process. One, you manufacture a crisis of debt and deficit by spending too much and taking in too little, often by cutting taxes on corporations and the wealthiest members of society. Two, you make a big issue out of this debt and deficit and appeal to ideas of fiscal responsibility or budget balancing to justify cuts to social services. And then three, you enact these cuts. Benefits and supports are reduced as a result. Then you go back to the first step, create another crisis of debt and deficit, rail against fiscal recklessness, and make more cuts. Repeat this enough, and eventually you will not have anything left. During the 1980s to the present day, the public community mental health system was essentially eroded to ground zero, exacerbating problems of homelessness, incarceration, and neglect. In the early 2000s, the George W. Bush administration released a commission on the mental health system in the United States, which bluntly described it as, quote, in shambles. In 2008, the financial crisis hit, and community mental health was again amongst the largest cut budget items across the country. And thereafter, more of the same continued. COVID in 2020 happened. The scope of the problem grew larger and larger and is now widely recognized as a mental health crisis. The only question is, what do we do about it? Today, the United States is in the same place that we were in the 1800s with Dorothy Dix. Cook County Jail, which is only a couple miles away, Rikers Island, and LA County Jail are all considered America's largest mental health treatment centers. Additionally, there's a large homeless psychiatric population across the country. While we've returned to this 19th century problem, you would think that we would not return again to failed 19th century solutions, but you would be wrong. There are people who are very much trying to bring us back to the 19th century solution. Because of the work of advocates like liberatory and the Treatment Advocacy Center, pro-institutional policy and civil commitment laws are pushed as practical, viable solution to today's crisis. These advocates, who are well-connected in media and in government, have successfully pushed a simplistic narrative that taking down asylums led directly to homelessness and incarceration, omitting a history where community-supported living was ever an aspiration and where political changes against a social safety net ever took effect. Tory and the Treatment Advocacy Center, or the TAC for short, have worked for decades to reinstate the policies of the institutional era, state by state, point by point. While they haven't been too successful, they've also never quit, and now the times are giving them an opportunity to refine and retry their project. They were often dismissed as being too extreme. For instance, it was not long ago that the TAC shared outrageous more or less fabricated statistics about mental illness and violence on its website. Today, its messaging is tamer and would appear more reasonable to the untrained eye. Additionally, they've fashioned themselves as experts on mental illness and violence and have run long-standing media campaigns to link the two. After any mass shooting, you can find them in the newspaper or on CNN talking about a crisis of, quote, untreated mental illness and the need for a mental health system, by which they mean the need for the old mental health system. The left may see this and hear an appeal to healthcare for the poor and helpless. The right may see this and see a way to deflect the conversation about mass shootings from gun control and to bring tough policy upon unwanted homeless and psychiatric populations. Everybody is pleased, and this creates a consensus to make the TAC vision politically and socially viable. There have been two large modern TAC-led attempts to broadly overhaul the mental health system in the United States, both introduced by the Republican representative of Pennsylvania, Tim Murphy, who I don't believe is in office anymore. In classic Treatment Advocacy Center style, the first Murphy bill was introduced after the Newton massacre, which, just to illustrate, opportunizing on a big crisis, portraying a population as violent, and then offering a paternalistic solution to do something about it. The bill had many of the hardline policies that would have restored the standards of the asylum era and was seen as too extreme, and it failed. A second version of the bill was introduced about 2 years later with watered-down versions of the same policies. It was during this time that assisted outpatient treatment, which Lindsay just defined, became a major point of conflict. While it may sound like AOT has some community-supported values, it ultimately depends on court-ordered involuntary treatment. And it also says nothing about what treatment people may be court-ordered into. That varies by place to place, as I think the others will demonstrate. One side of this debate saw AOT as the last gap of an institutional system. To them, in order to prevent the return of that system, AOT must be defeated. The other side saw it as the last hope of an institutional system and a gateway to more to come. The second Murphy bill passed with near unanimous approval in Congress. All but two anti-spending libertarians voted yes on it. It failed, however, in the Senate for reasons that are too politically tedious to get into right now. Finally, where are we today? The Trump administration is back, and the modern-day asylum advocates are right there with it. Early stages of institutional policy have been tried in New York City and California, where Eric Adams and Gavin Newsom authorized police power to assess people for mental illness, specifically homeless people, and for psychiatric hospitalization. This year, President Trump authorized an executive order to more or less the same effect. Right now, the state of Utah is proposing a 1,300-bed or a 1,300-person homelessness campus 7 miles outside of Salt Lake City, which would include 300 to 400 beds for civil commitment and would offer treatment for mental illness and substance abuse to Utah's homeless. The New York Times recently described this as the model for Donald Trump's treatment of this crisis of mental illness and homelessness, and critics note the similarities between this large homelessness encampment and asylums. And it goes without saying that Trump has his sympathizers throughout government and in the head of the HHS, amongst other places. It's a golden moment for the modern-day asylum advocates for whom AOT is a pathway to bring people back into the system. And it's a dangerous moment for everyone else. Advocates of a system of autonomy, community integration, and positive support are on the defensive and in need of a stronger message and movement. With that, I turn to our panelists.
I'm here to talk about a worst case and bring us all down further. So we'll just think along here about a possible broader context so that we know what we're trying to work against. We have just heard an historical overview of mental health systems in this country, but before we go on to think about where this trajectory has brought us and to consider how we might best address our current predicament, I believe it's essential to situate these systems within even broader contexts, as they are nested within the structures of ideological, political, socio-cultural, and economic power that shape and are shaped by them. Most salient, this panel is offered within a historical context that has repeatedly demonstrated the vulnerability of the mental health disciplines, and psychiatry in particular, to serve punitive carceral ends that violate human rights. The fact that the number of people with diagnosed mental illness in prisons is nearly 4 times the inpatient psychiatric population, as well as the high correlation between low availability of psychiatric beds and higher rates of incarceration of those diagnosed as mentally ill, attests to the slippage between classifications of criminality and emotional disorder, warranting critical concern regarding both systems. Further, given the low reliability of psychiatric diagnosis, as well as the otherwise justifiable constraints of confidentiality surrounding mental health treatment, this blurring of boundaries is easily available for exploitation by regimes of control, and particularly by techno-authoritarian political regimes, which are known for abusing the so-called mentally ill, as well as reclassifying legitimate opposition as psychiatric disability, as has been well documented in the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Russia, China, Belarus, Romania, Hungary, Cuba, India, Japan, Suriname, Thailand, and many other countries, unfortunately the United States among them. These instances highlight the overlap between these two related issues: the mandated way in which those diagnosed with mental illness are treated by the dominant regime, and the potential expansion of the concept of mental illness to accommodate individuals with views antithetical to those in power. Especially now, it seems not unreasonable to contextualize any current debate about forced treatment within our political landscape, as we witness the advent of new totalitarian disunited states, in which the popular tropes, such as that of the recently bandied wellness farms and accountability centers on the one hand, and TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, on the other, cannot be disregarded as harbingers of a renewed push to co-opt psychiatric care as a frontier of autocratic control. It's no coincidence that the current administration's effort to tout forced treatment as an answer to a variety of social ills, including homelessness, drug addiction, crime, and gun violence, is occurring simultaneously with a burgeoning disregard for human autonomy, self-determination, free expression, and the tolerance of difference across the board. This platform of disregard has enlisted previously established mental health policies that had been implemented in fragmentary and seemingly half-hearted ways, organizing these disparate initiatives into an increasingly unified approach towards those with mental health diagnoses, viewing these individuals as in need of carceral care. In this regard, civil commitment and assertive outpatient treatment are elevated as bipartisan concerns over which, quote-unquote, both sides can come together, as even avowed Democrats such as Gavin Newsom and Eric Adams have embraced care courts and involuntary removals that drain resources from systems that work in order to enforce mandatory systems that work better, in order to enforce mandatory treatments for those diagnosed as mentally ill, with seemingly no recognition as to the broader implications of embracing such policies, implications that go well beyond the political harm done to individual lives. Yet as Americans, we should view with caution, indeed alarm, the administration's attempt to overturn basic protections against arbitrary treatment and confinement. We should not rule our recognizing these political potential steps as a trajectory. We should not rule out recognizing these as a potential steps as steps in a trajectory that has led in the past to a series of executive actions that turn prior disastrously misguided but perhaps well-meaning policies into cannon fodder for the project of usurping individual autonomy. Think the president's and his partner there, Make America Healthy Again Commission, chaired by HHS's RFK, which calls for the removal of people with mental health diagnoses, and here there is no distinction between people whose lives are hugely and significantly impacted by their emotional pain and those who are simply taking prescription SSRIs, to rural areas where they will be cured through the provision of organic produce, among other efforts, although of course we can footnote the fact that this doesn't entail actual support for organic farming itself. There's the services campuses that are rising quickly in the Utah desert, as you've heard, that will be offering forced treatment for up to 1,300 people at a time in order to stem what is called the culture of permissiveness that is seen as a driver of substance abuse and homelessness. And then there is the recently signed EO entitled Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets, which conflates people who carry a mental health diagnosis, drug users, vagrant criminals, and people who are unhoused. We all know that this EO will likely have the effect not of reducing the number of so-called mentally ill and unhoused individuals, but rather will serve as an engine to generate a greater population of those who, under the order, qualify for forced detention and forced treatments that most have found dehumanizing and debilitating. In its language, the EO perpetuates the myth that mental illness is the prime cause of homelessness instead of recognizing that broader economic and systemic issues such as poverty, the lack of actually helpful social supports, and especially the scarcity of affordable housing are the most significant drivers of homelessness and the use of homeless services. This basic but erroneous assumption is likewise used to justify the fact that the executive order explicitly removes funding for programs that work, including Housing First and harm reduction services, and funnels it into systems that will likely cause far more trauma, the main driver of so-called mental illness, we might add, than they remedy. We like to approach the topic of punitive psychiatry from a perspective of over-there-ness, the idea that the abuse of psychiatry for ideological and political ends is something that happens far off in unfree autocratic regimes, which indeed it also does, to be sure, such that by now we have sufficient data to assert a significant correlation between despotic regimes, the abuse of psychiatric diagnosis towards political ends, and the systemic violations of human rights of the so-identified mentally ill, just as all aspects of social life tend to be infected by vectors of control in autocracies in general. Further, the examples before us allow us an increased conceptual vocabulary for understanding the ideological underpinnings of the various patterns of exploitation of the concept of mental illness that we find in repressive regimes, allowing us to link the centrality of the fantasy of genetic purity in the Nazi regime with the practice of murdering those who are deemed mentally ill since their deficiencies are supposedly hardwired and thus unredeemable. Indeed, this widespread practice is often overlooked by historians, giving the impression that the extermination camps were populated by Jews alone, though the innovation of using gas to poison those diagnosed with schizophrenia in asylums was the origin of a procedure that was only later adopted by extermination camps, some number of whose workers were employed first by psychiatric facilities until the populations of these institutions were liquidated and they were transferred to other positions of employment under the assumption that their years of experience working in asylums and killing off their residents rendered them well prepared for employment in the camps. This drive to snuff out the carriers of what were viewed as schizophrenia-producing recessive genes is in contrast to, for instance, the Soviet emphasis upon mental illness as a social ill justifying social removal and re-education, often equivalent to being worked to death, but through locking people up rather than relying quite as frequently and systematically upon execution to rid the country of the so-called weaknesses of its citizens. In this vein, there is our own country's tendency to rely on what history tells us has in the past been but the first page of an eradication policy, which was the sterilization of the mentally ill and particularly of so deemed mentally ill women, reflecting our society's preoccupation with the idea of female reproductive capacity and sexuality as a threat to the survival of the masculinized state. While we recognize that the Nazi regime's effort to accomplish its explicit goal of so-called racial hygiene occurred in two separate phases, first through a sterilization program as cemented through the 1933 laws for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, with its designated hereditary health courts, and then through a more radical solution, a second stage enacted by secret authorization in 1939, its Action T4 program, to kill those deemed disabled, whether physically or mentally. We must remind ourselves of our tendency to regard such programs through an over-there-ness lens, erasing from public consciousness, for instance, the widespread programs over here on our side of the pond for the sterilization of mentally ill women, especially, that were well funded by financial elites, with enthusiastic assistance by our professional organizations, including the American Psychological Association. In short, over there is closer than we can bear to think, and the correlation between fascist regimes and forced treatment, both their prevalence and their nature, should reinforce the need for extreme caution when it comes to debates about how and when the deprivation of a person's autonomy is necessary for their protection and the protection of their fellow citizens. Yet as we contemplate these most extreme endpoints of supposed mental health management, a prospect that seems crazy itself, we could say paranoid perhaps, except that it was to some extent already enacted in full over their land within the past century, as well as, at least in part, on our own shores, we might heed that adage coined in the 1976 docudrama All the President's Men, follow the money. There is great profit to be made in the privatization of prisons and work camps, in our case for the benefit not of our government or country, but transparently for the benefit of a few wealthy corporate investors. For instance, the overlap between prisons and psychiatric institutions will likely expand due to the infrastructure that is being put in place by the likes of CoreCivic and GEO Group, two companies upon which the federal government relies quickly to create tens of thousands of additional beds for the purposes of detention, as consistent with the president's aim not only to expel millions of supposedly foreign criminal elements from our soil, but also of, quote, returning people to mental institutions where they belong, unquote. While the only effective way to control individuals deemed mentally ill on a widespread basis was once to lock people behind walls, current innovations exist at this point to offer the state and other interested parties more options. Because of the development of new procedures and resources, often referred to as tools, for responding to mental illness diagnoses, medication, ECT, and other outpatient procedures among them, we must also recognize the financial interests that stand to reap huge profits through the forced outpatient treatment, AOT. Thanks to Yulia Mikolova and her crew for some of the information regarding one company that stands to profit from these supposed innovations, the venture capital firm 8VC, which creates surveillance tools to track compliance with medication regimes and funds companies that rely on long-acting injectables, which are a standard AOT tool. We can also highlight here the use of pill bottles that communicate to doctors how often they are opened, along with most recently the advent of Abilify MySite, an antipsychotic medication that includes a sensor that notifies a prescriber when it is taken orally. Sorry. In Yulia's words, quote, court-ordered treatment, which requires surveillance and complex administrative structures, creates a perfect market for these digital products, unquote. Perhaps a focus on the prior infamous abuses of power that we find throughout history seems far-fetched or even irrelevant to the essential discussions we need to be having regarding the forms and intensities of intervention that are most helpful to people whose extreme states have led them into dangerous situations. To be sure, it's one thing to speak about confining systems as offering a type of holding that can allow a person the space and safety to access themselves more fully, and quite another to speak of the sorts of confinement that deprive people of their agency as manifested in their capacities to make autonomous personal decisions, or even to deprive them of their very survival. Just as a good enough parent, Winnicott's term, walks a line between facilitating the emergence of their child's capacity to express and live their desires on the one hand, and a willingness to foreclose their child's potentially harmful impulses on the other, we are all obliged as stewards of our cultures and communities to appreciate the ways in which human impulses towards punishment, control, retaliation, and even obliteration of the other take over when people are threatened with senses of helplessness and terror, senses that are inevitably amplified when we encounter the helplessness and terror of others. Given the lack of data to support the benefit of AOT, civil commitment, and other forceful interventions for most people in most instances, as you will hear about, it falls on systems and their practitioners to question whether and to what extent These interventions are similar in kind, if not in degree, to the societal techniques of control that intensify the dialectic of domination and rebellion that lodges in all parties and structures as it progresses towards authoritarian aims. Of course, at this moment, many of the current administration's efforts towards controlling the mentally ill have taken a backseat to headlines devoted to the effort to round up people of color and terrorize immigrant communities, such that the most recent executive order seemingly dropped noiselessly into a bucket that overflows daily with a constant barrage of headlines aiming to shock and awe as we scroll through our social media feeds to read about the friends and neighbors who have been detained seemingly because of the way they looked or spoke. Yet I think the issue of immigration and mental health are intertwined in more ways than meet the eye, not merely in light of the high incidence of trauma experienced by Black and brown people and members of other minoritized groups in our country, resulting in myriad forms of emotional distress and current and post-traumatic terror, but because especially people with psychiatric diagnoses are in certain very real respect viewed as foreigners themselves, eliciting the same distrust, fear, and impulse to negate or retaliate that many seem to feel towards those who strike them as other. Those who make different life choices speak outside the bounds of consensual reality and evoke confusion in those around them, often feel like strangers in a strange land, foreign to their families and even often to themselves. It is not lost on us that the impulse towards incorporating the other under the sway of our control has always entwined the fate of the immigrant and the person deemed mentally ill. This is why we regard it as the task of those who possess relatively greater cultural capital and leverage to remind those in power of what is at stake in adopting policies that reinforce helplessness, silence, and isolation. The ability to speak for those who carry a mental health diagnosis in our political moment will depend upon efforts both to situate carceral mental health policies within the matrix of forces in our current political moment, and to remind policymakers that we have met the other and it is, after all, only us.
So as a group, we want to be clear. We see us all at an inflection point. AOT is the treatment and ultimately the mechanism du jour, fueled by the Trump administration's July EO, that we will continue to see expand if we don't actively work against it. Or aforementioned Treatment Advocacy Center, or TAC, has an expansive legislative and political strategy. They have targeted legislation for every single state in this country, targeted language, and targeted research ready to go. We're going to increasingly see things ramp up. In light of that, I'm going to try and ground you a little bit in the research as we see it and understand it, because you should be empowered with information, given the conversations I think we're all likely to continue to need to have. Okay. Coming back to our plenary talks, our keynote conversations that have been happening this weekend that have situated psychosis and the diagnosis of psychotic disorders and especially schizophrenia within not just cultural context, but within culturally and societally structured, if not engineered and imposed realities, it will likely come as no surprise that the current research based on AOT is largely divorced from its actual genesis and history, in which Matt and Nancy have eloquently grounded us. Let's come back to the definition. AOT is defined as a community-based, court-ordered mental health treatment program utilized in the United States for a subset of individuals with serious mental illness who have a history of involuntary hospitalizations, arrests, or demonstrated difficulty adhering to treatment and staying well while living in the community. It is critical to note that AOT takes place within the context of a civil court proceeding, and therefore the decision about whether or not someone will be mandated into AOT is ultimately made by a civil judge who typically has little to no training in mental health. This is in contrast with a similar but different process of court-ordered community treatment that takes place outside of the US in some countries where decisions are made within a specific mental health court by those with formal mental health training and education without the inclusion of a formal court order. This means that we cannot compare AOT with treatment approaches outside of the US that are discussed in the literature, as their mechanisms and legal context are fundamentally different. It is not uncommon to hear that AOT is supported as efficacious within the research when one talks to its proponents and legislators and policymakers who support its use here in the US. But what do we find when we look closely at that evidence? On first glance, it can appear that there is a wealth of research suggesting positive individual outcomes, such as improved treatment adherence, reduced hospitalizations, arrests, and incidents of violence. However, when we look more closely, some critical gaps quickly come into focus. First, it's important to note that the vast majority of the research demonstrating supposed positive outcomes comes out of New York State or North Carolina, is well over a decade old, and reflect very different programs in each location. Based on that, it's difficult and arguably unethical to generalize and say that we can expect to see similar outcomes in other contexts across the United States, where judicial involvement, availability of intensive outpatient programs, and other community-based supports vary widely, and overall shortages within the behavioral health workforce are also more prevalent. Treatment adherence in the AOT evidence base is often merely defined as compliance with taking psychotropic medication as prescribed, may include adherence with case management, and sometimes includes ongoing engagement with behavioral health services, such as therapy. What this research tends not to include are actual recovery-oriented outcomes, outcomes focused on quality of life, and the perspectives of the participants in AOT itself, and whether they have found it helpful, harmful, coercive, empowering, or something else altogether. Further, the New York State and North Carolina research that folks often look to as the evidence of AOT shows that Black and Latina participants had worse outcomes than their white peers. To put that more bluntly, only the white participants in the New York State AOT studies tended to have positive outcomes. Given racial disparities in who tends to be diagnosed with schizophrenia or considered non-compliant, potentially violent, and therefore more likely to be considered for AOT, not to mention who is more at risk of being involved in the criminal justice system and considered for AOT when it is pushed as a diversion program, this should give us pause. Few studies have actually looked at racial disparities in AOT, but those that do exist show that Black Americans are significantly overrepresented in AOT, even when controlling for diagnosis and service history. I'll note, despite AOT being pushed nationally and including being named as an under-researched priority by the White House in 2023, there remain no national standards or best practices regulating AOT implementation or what participation in AOT must include. No standard level of involvement of the judges or the civil courts, no defined minimums addressing what sorts of mental health services or community supports someone must receive in AOT, and no standards clarifying pathways of how someone enters into AOT. Is it a step down from hospitalization? Is it a step up from outpatient treatment? Is it a prison diversion program? Who is eligible for AOT? Are duly diagnosed patients included or excluded? What training do clinicians and those who are implementing AOT have in it specifically? In practice, this means that when states respond to claims that AOT has such great efficacy, they are often implementing AOT in ways that are significantly different than other AOT programs and pilots. Endeavoring to find true meta-analyses or randomized controlled trials of AOT and its outcomes does not improve the picture. Some observational studies across several programs showed modest improvements in reduction of hospital utilization, medication adherence, and improved service engagement only when AOT is accompanied by intensive community supports. We see this mirrored in an actual random controlled trial, RCT, in New York that found no significant reduction in readmissions or improved clinical outcomes compared to voluntary community care when services were already well-resourced. And several meta-analyses concluded that AOT alone does not reliably improve outcomes when compared with well-resourced voluntary care. Lastly, SAMHSA funded an 18-site pilot of AOT that ran from 2016 to 2020. They published results from the outcomes of only 6 sites. We have major questions about what the data shows at the 12 sites they did not report on. Even when we look at the 6 sites whose outcomes they did analyze, where they present good outcomes, again, largely based on things like medication adherence and without controls for the way in which hospitalization rates may vary for those in an AOT program because of administrative differences and not clinical differences. The researchers conclude, quote, "The question remains as to whether these AOT clients would have seen the same improvements without the court order." This brings me to a final point I want to emphasize. While many of the gaps and red flags in the research on AOT mirror issues with treatment programs in our field as a whole, the involvement of the civil courts, the role of coercion, and the loss of civil liberties and reduction in personal freedoms that are fundamental to AOT and how it works demand our specific consideration and attention. The role of coercion and infringement on personal liberties for individuals who have not been determined to be at present risk of harm to self or others, but who someone has decided through what is at best an unstandardized, under-researched, and underdeveloped reactionary process is an alarming deviation from existing standards of care and due process within our field at large. We believe that this is harmful not just to the participants in AOT. As we do know, there's a lot of robust research capturing the grave harms of forced treatment. I'll refer you to Jim Gottstein's report on mental health outcomes and the vitally important research coming out of Allegheny County, where the stark loss of life as a consequence of forced treatment is well documented over time. But we believe AOT is also harmful to the communities it endeavors to serve because it risks eroding trust in the mental health system as a whole. This potential impact of AOT has, not surprisingly, also not been explored in the research. Lastly, to piggyback of some of the themes explored yesterday by Dr. Jessica Aranella and Ross Tappan in their talk, Crossing Enemy Lines, the Local Politics of Institutionalization, we want to raise questions and concerns about the impacts on clinicians themselves when they are expected to implement forced treatment approaches that carry serious risks of harm and have little to no efficacy like AOT. Acting as the Mental Health Autonomy Alliance, those of us talking to you about AOT here today successfully stopped a bill here in Illinois this past session that aimed to lower the threshold for Illinois residents being court-ordered into AOT from 2 mental health evaluators to 1, a change that would have eroded due process dangerously, and a change driven by the belief that the main proponent of the bill holds, quote, "There are far worse things than coercion." This champion of AOT is an attorney who has little to no knowledge of non-carceral approaches to caring for psychosis or extreme states, and as an attorney and not a care provider, when he looks around and sees people suffering, he has a hammer and everything becomes a nail. He is not versed in the actual literature and research about AOT, frequently quotes talking points from the Treatment Advocacy Center, and he does not understand that there are ways in which the mental health system and the diversity of available treatments and supports can be improved that do not rely on mandated care or forced treatment and have much greater efficacy. We believe he's an exemplar of the sort of policymaker that we all need to be increasingly willing and prepared to talk to. To paraphrase Sasha Warren in his keynote this morning, as the state works to dismantle the machine of mental health care and the community and social supports that work while simultaneously kicking that machine into high gear. Lauren's going to talk with you now about alternatives to AOT and forced treatment. Thanks.
Hi. I'm going to speak about clinical alternatives. That's okay. But first, the question of clinical alternatives is firstly a question of paradigm. As any true alternative must be born out of a different worldview. So let's begin there. What paradigm does AOT fall within? And within that paradigm, what is the identified problem? And how does AOT position itself as the solution to that problem? So AOT rests within the medical model paradigm. I imagine we all know what that is, but still. It understands, the medical model paradigm understands manifestations of severe or chronic psychological distress as symptoms of biological defect, say a faulty serotonin system producing anhedonia, fatigue, hopelessness, or suicidal ideation. Like any untreated illness, mental illness is thought to worsen over time, leading to increased symptoms and reduced functioning. While treatments exist, primarily in the form of medication, many people with severe mental illness remain untreated, or, as TAC says, treatment non-adherent. According to the medical model, this is largely because of a symptom called anosognosia. Anosognosia, from Greek a meaning without, gnosis disease, and gnosis meaning knowledge, refers to a lack of insight into one's own condition. French neurologist Joseph Babinski coined the term in 1914 to describe stroke survivors who are unaware of their paralysis. It later applied to people with Alzheimer's disease who, in later stages of the disease, no longer know that they are ill. By the 1980s, during the development of the DSM-3, anosognosia, or lack of insight, entered the mental health lexicon in relation to schizophrenia specifically. The DSM-3 marked psychiatry's full embrace of the medical model, introducing discrete diagnostic categories for the first time. And while the DSM-3 didn't use the word anosognosia, it did describe lack of insight as a symptom of some disorders, and by the time the DSM-4 came out, anosognosia was listed as a symptom of schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, and even cited as the primary reason for treatment non-adherence. The Treatment Advocacy Center is very, very concerned with anosognosia. It's like the biggest thing to them. They're obsessed with it. And have papers on it, and they want you all to be very concerned with anosognosia as well. According to TAC, all of this is true. 60% of people with schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders experience some degree of anosognosia, and 30% severely so. Complete anosognosia, they have no idea that they are ill. And 50% of people with bipolar disorder experience some degree of it, with 20% having no idea that they are ill. Left untreated, TAC warns anosognosia leads to relapse, hospital recidivism, increased symptoms, reduced community functioning, unemployment, violence, and, of course, treatment non-adherence, because no one knows they're ill. Okay, so within the medical model, the problem is clear. The problem is mental illness, and the solution is treatment adherence. But all these people are walking around, and they're not adhering to treatment. So thanks to the DSM-3, anosognosia, once a symptom of stroke or Alzheimer's, has become the new explanation, a symptom of severe mental illness that causes people to refuse treatment. In TAC's mission, this is on their website, by the way, in TAC's mission to, quote, eliminate barriers to timely and effective treatment, they've identified anosognosia as the central obstacle, the enemy number one in their, quote, fight for the lives of people with severe mental illness. Their proposed solution is, of course, mandated treatment, known as AOT. So what is AOT exactly? We've talked about it here a little bit. You should know that all AOT actually is a series of mandates or essential elements. There's 9 of them. And as Matt referenced, only one of those essential elements actually even references treatment. The rest focus on identification, compulsion, and compliance. So AOT, this is actually the very first essential element of AOT is identification, and it specifically puts identification, the task of identification, into the hands of mental health providers. Apparently, we are the ones who are the best suited to spot treatment non-adherence in the general population, round those individuals up, and then petition them for AOT. So the others focus on identification, on compulsion and compliance. AOT identifies people who appear non-adherent, petitions the court for forced treatment, and then uses legal mechanisms to ensure adherence. It maintains communication between providers and the court, monitors compliance, and renews orders as needed. In practice, AOT is as much a legal system as a clinical one, if we could even call it that. A mechanism of identification and coercion that leverages the court to enforce prescribed care. And the underlying logic is simple. If a person denies their illness, they can't be trusted to care for themselves. Therefore, the system must step in and take responsibility for their wellness. There are obviously many problems with this, but the one that I want to focus on is that this logic is wholly fear-based. It's rooted in the belief that people with what some call severe mental illness are dangerous, incapable, or both, irrational actors asleep at the wheel who might do something terrible if left untreated. It's a logic that is incurious, dehumanizing, and frankly, terrifying. Within this fear-based framework, AOT treats non-compliance as the greatest danger of all, not poverty, trauma, isolation, despair, or the system's own twisted logic, but the refusal of the medical model itself. In this way, AOT functions not as care, but as control. AOT is no better, in my opinion, than a straitjacket, no better than conversion therapy. It renders a person's way of being in the world wholly aberrant, something to be corrected, to be shaped into an altogether different form. And in contrast to that, we have alternative paradigms, which is where I'm going to pivot. So the rest of the presentation will focus on that. We will move away from all this nasty shit and talk about clinical alternatives. So I do swear always. All right, so let's talk about that. All right, I lost my place. Alternative paradigms. So alternative paradigms begin elsewhere. Alternative paradigms do not begin rooted in fear, orienting instead from a place of love over fear and curiosity over control. Alternative paradigms position people's experiences as theirs to define. From here, we frame the problem differently. Many people are experiencing severe and chronic psychological distress, and they're not engaging in available supports. Why? And from a place of humility, we then can listen to what people say about why they do or don't engage. And we have a lot of information about this. We have a lot of qualitative and quantitative information about why people say they do and don't engage in the system that is available to them. Why are they not engaging with medication, with therapy, with crisis lines? What actually fosters engagement and what drives people away? And what we learn is that at the center of engagement is relationship. The relationship between provider and client. And as Lindsay importantly pointed out, AOT will only continue to further erode these relationships. And that is, it's very tragic. It's the center, it's what matters the most. A strong, trusting relationship may in fact be the most influential factor in treatment participation. Collaborative, person-centered, and low-barrier approaches also improve engagement, as do diverse modalities, providers, and culturally humble practices. And unsurprisingly, and as we've already talked about, voluntary treatment is consistently associated with better satisfaction and outcomes, while involuntary treatment tends to reduce both and may not produce better results at all. Yet for many in severe distress, especially those on Medicaid or Medicare, which for many people who live with chronic and severe psychological distress, they are on Medicaid and Medicare, treatment options remain quite limited. Existing services often default to short-term behavioral interventions, coercive practices, and are offered by overburdened, undertrained providers. With turnover rates in community mental health hovering between 30 to 50%, and community mental health centers typically operating as kind of training grounds for brand new clinicians waiting to get their clinical license so that they may leave for private practice. We are we have providers who are stretched thin and fearful, trained in liability-driven, fear-based models. Under such pressure, providers often locate the problem in the, quote, difficult client, and we can understand why that might be a person's, understanding of what is happening. And family and friends, too, exhausted by fear and crisis, can fall into this same framing. So it's no wonder that people are not engaging with services. If we truly want to remove barriers to accessing treatment, we must look to programs that engage folks, programs that actually heal. These programs, which we can see as successful alternatives to AOT, share a common orientation. They fall outside the medical model and within an alternative paradigm, one that believes there is meaning in what a person says and how a person behaves, no matter how strange it may seem to you, no matter how incoherent, no matter how disturbed you may be by it. In these approaches, psychological distress is understood as rooted in painful experience. What has happened to a person matters, and within their symptoms live their stories. Rather than defining problems and solutions for the individual, these paradigms recognize individuals as the experts of their own experience, recognize healing as non-linear and multifaceted, responsive to both the known and the mysterious. Successful alternatives also recognize the necessity of meeting basic human needs, housing, food, and safety without coercion. And distrust of authority is understood as valid, even logical, given the likelihood of past harms inflicted by helping systems. Borrowing tax phrasing, successful clinical alternatives share essential elements, such as lateral relationships and the centering of lived experience, or as KK puts it, human-to-human work. Emphasis on relationship building and organic engagement, opportunities for art, self-expression, and culture making, provision of basic needs without coercion, multidisciplinary teams and diverse treatment options, person-centered, self-directed treatment, meaning-making opportunities, and voluntary participation. These alternatives are non-prescriptive and at least partially mad. If I had it my way, like clinic spaces would be totally mad. And by this, what I mean is spaces that welcome autonomy, incoherence, imagination, and non-linearity. An openness which allows for an unfolding on one's own terms. Allows for, as Mike said earlier this morning in a presentation I was very fortunate to go to, allows for the dignity of risk, which I thought was a very beautiful phrase. He also said that we must take risks to heal, which I also found to be incredibly important. And we need spaces that allow us to take risks to heal. Spaces that honor the dignity of risk. These programs emerge not from fear, but from love for the vastness of human experience, for the spirit and greatness in us all, and out of the belief that everyone can heal, no matter how lost to us they may seem. Yeah. Sorry, that's very meaningful to me. Unlike AOT, these approaches do not require people to adopt medical model language to demonstrate insight. I'm crying now, Nancy. Thanks. Unlike AOT, these approaches do not require people to adopt medical model language to demonstrate insight, whatever that means. They honor each person's own meaning-making system, inviting their suffering, hopes, fears, and dreams to speak out in their own language. I'm going to provide a few examples. Some of them Sasha mentioned this morning. I'm going to try to pronounce some things right, and I probably will not do that well. The first is Hail, Belgium, which may not have ultimately be as successful as we might hope, but the model itself is quite beautiful, the intention, which, for over 700 years, families have been opening up their homes to individuals experiencing psychological distress from the hospital, after the hospital, go to this town. They're called boarders, not patients. I think what's really meaningful to me about this model is that the families are not trained as mental health providers, or at least weren't at some point, and just opened their home to somebody living there with them, and through that process, healing could arise organically. I think that's incredible. I would love to do that here. I've thought about it a lot. I have a lot of ideas. I'm not sure any of them are feasible, but we'll keep thinking. Okay, Trieste, Italy. Okay, we heard about that this morning. So we know about that one, recognized by the World Health Organization as one of the world's most advanced community-based systems. Trieste integrates individuals into every aspect of community life. Spread throughout the town, community mental health centers operate 24/7. Sasha described them beautifully this morning. I also want to go. And they're available for gathering, respite, and services. There's one ward in the general hospital, but there are no locks, no restraints, and there's no forced treatment. Here, quote, intrapsychic problems exist within a whole life and societal context, and the context itself can be part of the problem and the solution. Soteria houses, so cool. Let's work on that as well. Soteria houses are therapeutic residential community homes for people experiencing distressing extreme states, staffed by people with lived experience. They practice being with, staying present and curious about a person's experiences rather than managing them. They're free, they're non-restrictive, they're staffed 24/7. 388 in Quebec is a psychoanalytic treatment center for psychosis. 388 offers a milieu-based treatment that includes psychosocial rehabilitation and case management alongside an intensive multi-year psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Quebec's public housing system, luckily, is sufficient, and so most participants are housed nearby. Housing first. Housing first is incredible. We should be doing it. This approach prioritizes permanent housing without preconditions, no sobriety, treatment, or work requirements. It's not a complete model in itself, but it is a critical component of any model. If we're thinking about bringing forward models, we have to be thinking about housing because there is none. And the housing that people do have, they're constant risk of losing it because of the way that they engage in the world. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy. This is a treatment modality that is not typically endorsed as a treatment modality that should be used for people who experience what is referred to as psychosis. It is a long-term psychotherapeutic modality that supports meaning-making and insight through relationships and free association, through relationship and free association. It is intrinsically non-coercive, and it is actually quite effective when it comes to treatment modality for folks who experience distressing extreme states. Open dialogue, developed in Finland in the 80s. Open dialogue is a relationally based therapeutic modality which takes place in the natural environment and includes the individual's primary social network. Practitioners work together with individuals in their network, generating insight through collaborative dialogic encounters which emphasize and explore stories over symptoms. Two more. Hearing Voices Network. Hearing Voices Network groups seek to normalize and destigmatize voice hearing through supporting the development of peer-run groups by and for people who hear voices, see visions, and or have other similar experiences. They are voluntary, non-directive, and non-diagnostic. And Center for Mad Culture, if folks got to hear that beautiful presentation just before us. Center for Mad Culture is located in the Fine Arts Building in downtown Chicago. And is reclaiming madness as cultural belonging. The center spreads awareness of mad history, provides opportunities for art making and self-expression, engages in mad advocacy, and welcomes folks to the center for respite, social time, and learning from shelves stacked with everything madness. And now there's a second one in Edinburgh. I want to share an example of what becomes possible when we honor mad culture and mad space. This story comes to us from Trieste, Italy, 1974, after the psychiatric hospital there had been revolutionized. And I'm going to read from an excerpt from an article entitled "A Public Mental Health Model in Italy Earns Global Praise. Now it faces its demise." Try to keep it upbeat, but okay, so here goes. Pancho Ramos, who is in charge of the hospital's archive, says it became a cultural hub, including a memorable 1974 concert for patients by an American jazz master. And Ornette Coleman, the jazz master, said this was the most deep, free jazz concert he did in all his life, Ramos says. Shortly before the concert, Ramos recounts a 50-year-old patient named Rosetta Lahacono walked onto the empty stage and started playing her harmonica. Coleman joined her, and their jam session lasted more than an hour. Quote, "He lost sense of who was a musician, who was an audience," Rama says, "who was a doctor, who was an artist, who was a listener. And I think that is a moment of poetry, and I feel that this is a place of poetry." Interviewed later by one of the concert organizers, the saxophonist Coleman Hawkins said, quote, "I felt totally at ease, very normal. I liked that feeling. We were all free. Imagine feeling normal and at ease around a bunch of people with diagnoses that we live in such fear of." That's kind of the end, but there's a few more things I'm just gonna add here. And one of them is about subverting AOT. So AOT is here, it is here, and we are gonna fight it with everything we've got, and it will still be here, and we'll still see the rise of it. I'm certain of that. And so people in this room may find themselves ending up working someplace where they are treating individuals who are mandated. So what do we do? Sasha spoke this morning about power versus authority. Providers do have power here because documentation is a critical part of this process. So what do? We are very careful about what we put in our notes, and we are very intentional about what we submit when it comes to documentation. So I have not worked with somebody mandated through AOT, but I've worked with people who are in the court system who I've had to give reports about engagement, to the court system. And my report is always exactly the same, and it says that they've done everything they're supposed to, and it will always say that forever, no matter what that person does. That's my power. I have power in that space. So we can subvert through documentation, through what we consider engagement. Thanks to Ali over here, who's in New Orleans and is doing this work, this very beautiful work of subverting AOT. And we talked a little bit before about, how these are ways we can do it. So that's one thing. And the other thing I want to say is that it is necessary that we bring forward these alternatives. So if you want to do this work, if you see a program that you like and you think that you can do it better, figure out how to do it and go build that program. You can figure out how to build a community mental health center. You can figure out how to build a nonprofit. You can figure out how to build anything it is that you want to make. If you have an idea about how to do this work, please do it so that we have increasingly more and more ways to show those who need research to prove what we know intuitively to be true, and that people heal best in spaces that are loving and kind and free. And the very last thing I will say is that we will be continuing this conversation on January 23rd and 24th. The Mental Health Autonomy Alliance at the Center for Mad Culture will be hosting a convening of sorts. We have not titled it yet, to continue having conversations, learning and activation. So see you there. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Candace will be handling questions in the room, and I will handle the chat questions. So if you'd like to start, go ahead.
I really thought this was incredibly informative and really terrific panel. And my only wish would have been that this would have been a plenary during a time when the whole group was here, because this is really important stuff. And I would encourage the four of you to think possibly of updating this and redoing this very same panel next year, but as a plenary so our whole group could be part of this. I think it's incredibly, incredibly important and pertinent what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping it would be outdated by then.
Oh. We might need more than an hour or however much time we have by then. Yeah.
We have a question online here. Where can we find resources and information about the ineffectiveness of AOT? It would be helpful to have to share with people at work and with families considering a petition.
We will happily share with you a resource list of all the stuff we were referencing today.
Also, just Google whether or not involuntary treatment is effective, and you will find a whole lot of resources that tell you it is not effective.
Jim Gottstein's white paper on mental health outcomes is fantastic and is specifically written with policymakers as a target, and is also a wonderful foundational resource for those sorts of conversations. And I, again, sound like a broken record, I would encourage you to get familiar with the long-term research coming out of Allegheny County in Pennsylvania that really is quite illuminating on the significant impacts in an actual long-term context of forced treatment.
One thing to add just on that note is that one of the challenges here is that we actually, Allegheny County is like, I think this is like the first or one of the only studies actually out there on involuntary commitment. AOT and involuntary commitment in general, it's really challenging to find data about those things because of like HIPAA and just a whole bunch of things that mean that we don't have a lot of data. One thing that you can do is you can push policymakers to start collecting data. Allegheny County has, they have some policies, right, that allow for this?
Yeah, most long-term research, long-term is maybe a bit of a euphemism, doesn't tend to look more than a year, perhaps 2 years into the future. Allegheny looked over a much longer stretch of time, and our experience here in Illinois, we have not yet put into effect a data collection bill, but we're hoping to see that within the next year. It's a great starting point to be fighting back. We need data, and we need data that reflects what's happening now so that we can capture what's not actually working in the harms.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to put out there, there's another resource program that isn't focused on mental health per se. It's called Recovery Cafe. I don't know if you came across that out in Seattle. I visited there a while ago when I was potentially interested. It's basically for anybody, there's a very low bar to entry. You have to show up to one sort of group-like situation a week, and that's it. And they have, it's a little bit like, it's not as formal as a clubhouse, but they actually have a cafe where they teach people things and everybody pitches in and does jobs. And they bring resources there just for people to be interested. If they're not interested, they don't have to participate. But they actually help and provide a technical assistance for like a fee, but to help people recreate the cafes in different places. So you might add that to your list of things to look into.
That's great. Yeah, Clubhouse is also a good model. Who's going to start a recovery cafe in Chicago? Yes, we will.
Here we have a question here. Can you please discuss guardianship for incapacitated persons due to mental illness, which is even worse than AOT? Also, how many people on AOT are institutionalized? How many and what percentage of people on AOT kill themselves?
We wish there was data answering some of those questions. Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, who wants to start talking about
I was going to talk to suicidality and just kind of recognizing that one of the major predictors of suicidality is a history of hospitalization, especially hospitalization against one's will. The odds go up enormously after that experience.
Guardianship is we could have maybe next year we could have another whole
Yeah, we
panel
could
on
have a
guardianship.
whole-
The only thing the only thing I'll say very briefly about guardianship is that if we have more models that exist in an alternative paradigm, then we have less people coming forward saying that they would like to have, to have guardianship. So I think the answer often is like to turn to our communities and see like how we can bring forward more and more spaces where people can be, can be mad. My dream is for Chicago to be a place one day where you can be totally fucking insane anywhere, at any time, and that is welcome. So we need more spaces where people can be mad.
Yeah, and one of the things we have to distinguish is guardianship by families and guardianship by the state. Families are pretty desperate in a lot of ways. They're, kind of part of the process of, we could say that if someone carries a diagnosis, it's always a family diagnosis, or maybe not always, that's strong. But, they're family troubles that incorporate an individual as well. And, kind of the more resources there are for working with families, the less helpless families would feel. And so, kind of we're trying to think at all levels at once.